This is the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you find it. Today's guest is my Reason colleague, Brian Doherty, who's just published Modern Libertarianism, a brief history of classical liberalism in the United States. His previous books include Radicals for Capitalism, the absolutely indispensable history of the libertarian movement, and other titles of his cover the Ron Paul Revolution, Gun Rights, Burning Man, and Underground comic books. Modern Libertarianism analyzes the legacies of figures such as Ludwig von Mises, F.A. Hayek, Murray Rothbard, Milton Friedman, and Barry Goldwater. We talk about Ayn Rand and the other two women who helped conceptualize libertarian thought at the very beginning of the movement, Rose Wilder Lane and Isabel Paterson. And we discuss how libertarians have played leading roles, if often overlooked roles, in battles about free speech, international trade, immigration, deregulation, drug legalization, and lifestyle liberation. This interview was recorded at the Reason Speakeasy, a live monthly event in New York City. Check the show notes for more information on that. Here is the Reason Interview with Brian Doherty. This is the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie. All right. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much for coming out. Tonight's guest is Brian Doherty, my longtime colleague at Reason Magazine and the author of a shelf full of interesting books. Which that streak ended with this one, right? Yeah. But no, this is a really great, tight, brief history of classical liberalism in the United States called Modern Libertarianism. It's published by the Cato Institute. Brian, first off, thanks for coming out.
Of course, it's a joy.
And let's talk a little bit about why this book now. I mean, in a way, this book is it's not a primer in a textbook.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I mean, yeah. So I had visited the topic of the history of libertarian ideas in America before in a much longer and harder to get through book. And I did feel in these inflationary times, or whatever you want to call these times, that I did want to return to the basics of libertarian thought in a simple way. And because we're human beings, and just in the actuality of human reality, it's certain human beings promulgated these ideas and were successful in promulgating them. It becomes about a bunch of people, but really it ultimately is and should be about the ideas. But the people are fun to contemplate, especially when the book's narrative mostly starts in the mid-40s. You know, it's wartime centralization, fascism and communism fighting to take over the globe.
It seems so different from today's book. Right? Yeah.
The New Deal and, wartime centralization really upset people who believed in what were then called 19th century classical liberal values. And one of the great fun of this book to me is how very embattled and strange these characters had to be to believe this stuff, because no one did.
Talk about
it's
that.
A common theme in here. Like one of the characters is a woman named Isabel Paterson, who wrote a great foundational book called The God of the Machine. That's not read enough these days, but if you read it, you'll feel like, oh, this is all the stuff libertarians have been saying for the last 60 years. And she actually had a position of respectability within the New York intellectual circles. There was a paper then called the New York Herald Tribune, not around anymore, but she was a prominent book critic for that. So she knew the big fancy thinkers, and Edmund Wilson was a friend of hers, the famous critic, and he actually told her, the quotes in the book, I might mangle it a little, but she was like, Isabel, you are the last person who believes in the ideals upon which this American Republic was founded. And it was common that all of these people thought that they were the only one. And when they found each other, and the archival work that I've done in libertarian history has been a lot of fun, because they all wrote each other. They all hashed things over. Like, it was more of a gang than a movement. Like, literally through the 60s, it was like a dozen or more people who made up the actual intellectual content. I mean, they had an audience that got into the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands, but it was a very small group of people. So they were eccentric.
They found each other, and then
then
they started hating each other.
Exactly.
You mentioned kind of their characters. Isabel Paterson is a is a really interesting character. And Brian's previous kind of authoritative history of the modern libertarian movement is called Radicals for Capitalism. Highly, highly recommend it. And I know you talk about Paterson in that and in other writings, but she only had 2 years of formal education.
Yeah. Her and Rose Wilder Lane, who was kind of her analog in a lot of ways. This book tells it. Like, it's kind of thing libertarians are a little bit proud of. You probably hear it from libertarians a lot. That 1943 kind of 3 foundational texts of the movement came out, all written by women. This is really, in many ways, a woman-founded movement. One of them was the Paterson book I just mentioned. One was Ayn Rand's novel, The Fountainhead. And the other was Rose Wilder Lane's The Discovery of Freedom, which is very similar to Paterson's book in many ways. They both were they looked at a world, the West, America, that was unprecedentedly rich and free. And they tried to figure out why and explain why. And in doing so, they basically promulgated the values of libertarianism, private property, maximal individual freedom. And they both stressed that it was about ideas that, like, I mean, you could argue this and somehow, but to them, America's success was ideological. Like, it wasn't about natural resources. It wasn't about the character of the people. It was about that the country was run by a set of ideas that allowed for the flourishing of freedom and wealth. And they were very afraid in World War II times that these values were being crushed. And so they tried to revive them, and they failed completely. Like, both of them were reasonably successful. Rose Wilder Lane had been a popular novelist. She was a big writer for the Saturday Evening Post when that was a big deal. This is a little controversial in Laura Ingalls Wilde scholarship, but a lot of people believe she more or less ghost wrote her mother, Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House books. She was a big figure.
She clearly edited them significantly. I mean, I don't think we need to assign authorship, but without her, those books would not have seen print at all, probably, and certainly not in the form that they did.
I think that's fair. But like, both of them, Rand actually succeeded with her fiction and launching a great career. Paterson and Lane both kind of ended their careers by writing these books about a bunch of ideas that no one cared about. And they kind of both, they both had rural, Rose lived her mother's books. In a way, Isabel Paterson was also from the West. They both married guys when they were young and kind of like lost track of them very quickly, though they kept their last names.
And talk about that with Paterson in particular. I mean, she is probably the least well known because she doesn't have the Little House connection or Rand's. But Isabel Paterson, I mean, where was she from? She has 2 years of education. She ends up in New York with a husband who's like, I don't know. I was putting boxes out one day and he just never came back.
She was a classic American frontierswoman. And, and one of the things she said that's quoted in the book is that, a lot of people think that life teaches you that you need to be a cussed, rugged, complete, disconnected individualist. And she knew, and it's very libertarian, though a lot of people don't associate libertarianism with this idea, that no, the way things had to work out on the frontier is people had to cooperate. But it was best, she believed, when they cooperated freely. It was not a matter of being, a super rugged individualist. And she ended up in the big city. She was a very kind of Dorothy Parker-like character, but she didn't have the right ideas to be part of that crowd. She was a witty, singular woman who thought herself kind of above the herd and smarter than everyone else, and in many ways she was. And she's fun to contemplate. This book is very brief and tight. You'll learn a little bit about her if you become fascinated with her. My Radicals for Capitalism has more. And a great character. And all.
Where can I ask? You said, and we'll come back to the question of women in some meaningful way, kind of starting the libertarian movement or kind of creating the broad universe that gets filled in. But in a second, with Paterson and Rose Wilder Lane and certainly Rand too, there's this sense that it's ideas. Right. Like, does Paterson or Lane talk about where did those ideas come from? Is there any kind of sociology or intellectual history, or is it just kind of like they came over on the Mayflower?
Kind of like their books are not books for the solid intellectual history. And in fact, Lane's was kind of eccentric. She was very into Islamic civilization. She saw a lot of the ideas of liberty first, flowering in Islamic civilization around, the 800s to the 1100s. She talks about that a lot. I wouldn't say they're the place to go to like learn, Adam Smith, Lebanon Mill, and all that. Like, those ideas underlay them, but they were not trying to provide intellectual history. They were just trying to say, okay, how is it that we keep a culture and a country that's rich and free, and they felt that was going away, and they wanted to remind
Talk
people.
a little bit about, the irony of, Lane, Paterson, Rand being big at the beginning of a movement that, this is actually a pretty good gender mixed, group. But for a long time, one of the slams or maybe just acute observations of the libertarian movement is that it was heavily male. What can you say about?
Yeah, I mean, it had been heavily male, certainly when I came up when I was young. I don't want to speculate about why that is. I mean, especially pre-21st century, you kind of had to be a bit of a self-conscious weirdo, to get into this stuff. That's the thing that I
now that weirdness it's a medical diagnosis. Right?
Yeah, I mean, because Lane, and this is,
but I mean, why? I guess maybe you could argue that it's true of, a hard left culture was more dominated by men than women too. But I mean, like, if you had Rand, Paterson, and Lane kind of at the top of stuff, why weren't there more ladies?
I don't have an answer to that. I mean, and there have been, we, the magazine that we both work for, we were both hired by a female editor, Virginia Bustrell, who took over when she was in her 20s, which I think is a rare,
from
another female editor. So yeah, it's not. I think it is true that the masses, such as they were of libertarians, skewed male, but like the makers and the doers and the idea pushers never were. Yeah, Lane, and this quote is in the book, and she points out that, in the 50s context, if they got wind, literally, that there was a bright high school student somewhere that believed in this stuff, like that would be a moment of great excitement and a moment of great work, and they'd all start writing that bright high schooler and really try to reel him in, and that's how tiny it was. And the biggest funding organization for these ideas in the 50s is called the Volcker Fund, which dissolved in very colorful circumstances in the early 60s. They couldn't work like a modern funding organization that's like, oh, well, we'll put out the notice that we're accepting grant applications. Like, they had to go find people to support and give money to. And they hired like Rose Wilder, Lane, and Murray Rothbard to like scour academic journals for people who believed in any of this stuff. And one of the program officers, Richard Cornell, who I interviewed, and this quote is in the book, he's like, when we would find one of these people and approach them, like it would often be tearful. They were just like, their heart burst to realize, oh my God, there's other people who believe in this stuff. Like,
and they have money. Yeah, that's the real problem.
And like, the whole, like 6 different Nobel Prize winners in economics got supported by the Volcker Fund. They definitely.
Yeah, who started the Volcker Fund?
A guy named William Volcker, who was just kind of a rich civic guy in Kansas City, but it was run by a fellow named Lou Now. Yeah. And he kind of fell under the spell of Christian Reconstructionism. And this story is told a little bit in this book and more in detail in Radicals for Capitalism. He just decided that he was surrounded by a bunch of nutty libertarian atheists, and he just sort of stopped funding things. It's a little more complicated than that.
Was libertarianism in the 40s and 50s closely identified with atheism or anti-religion, or not necessarily?
Well, and it should have been if it wasn't, because Ayn Rand, who was the leader, was militantly atheist. And certainly, there was a lot of commingling between what would now and even then be called the American right or conservative movement in the 40s and 50s and the libertarian movement, because they were united at least in their desire to like roll back the New Deal and, end business regulations and such like. But they disagreed a lot on foreign policy, and the libertarian end was more likely to be atheist. Leonard Read, who founded the first recognizably modern libertarian educational, idea pushing operation, which is still around. He called it the Foundation for Economic Education, which is an important idea I'll get back to. He was a real religious weirdo. He was, if you read his journals, which I got the chance to, it seemed pretty, there was a lot of acid actually flowing.
I mean, literal LSD.
Yeah, literally, yeah.
Okay.
So LSD had a lot of him. That I don't know. I don't think I get into that a lot in this book. This book is
you got to save something for the sequel.
Yeah, this book is kind of aimed at, a kind of younger audience almost in a way.
Yeah, and they don't want to hear about acid. Because the reality we live in is so great.
So, so there was a lot. There was a lot of kind of Eastern mysticism through Read.
So talk a bit about his acid eating. I mean, he's like a
It's not 1,000% confirmed, but from reading, his friends definitely were. There was
you were on acid when you were reading about his
there was a
letters,
friend, if you're into like the history of Eastern mysticism in America, you might have heard of a guy named Gerald Hurd, and Gerald Hurd was part of Reed's circle.
Yeah, Gerald Hurd is one of the great popularizers and kind of spreaders of psilocybin and mescaline.
So I know there's some who argue that Reed did not actually do it. I think from what I read in the journals that he did, even though at a certain point he denied it, but he knew people would be reading these things. He knew. So I think it was lying.
So he was. But he
definitely was a super mystic. Like if you read his stuff, I pencil his essay is like one of the where he's like thinking like how you look at a pencil.
He was tripping really, balls. He's like, really man, the whole universe is here.
And this really is like I'm making light of it because it's goofy in a way, but it really is one of the best essays about how a free economy works. Like the idea is he's looking at it and he comes to the realization like, no, here it is. I have this. I have a drawer full of them. Nobody knows how to make a pencil. No one can make a pencil. Like only a world-straddling, connected through intelligence and the price system somehow gets together. The metal of the ferrule and the wood, and it really does explain that the free market is like a miracle when you really think about it, man.
Yeah. When you drop when the acid kicks in, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a miracle.
And it's true. I Pencil by Leonard Reed.
Talk about fee a little bit, because that's another, like the Volcker Fund. And one of the things I find really interesting about this book, if you're, many of you will know, as you know, a lot of the stories and whatnot, but this does a great job of sketching kind of it's like an economic and intellectual infrastructure. You mentioned the Volcker Fund is like, you know, dollar for dollar, like produced more Nobel Prize winners than like anything else in the world. And Fee also had like they funded a lot of people at really important points in their careers.
Milton Friedman, you know, Ayn Rand was involved in the early days, and she actually was, you know, we alluded to, but didn't really get into how contentious this whole world was. Like, and it's still the case to this day. Every libertarian kind of against every other libertarian for some reason. And Friedman had written a kind of anti-rent control pamphlet, but Rand was really upset.
George Stiegler, right? Or
Stiegler, yeah,
I think so. Who's another Nobel Prize winner? Yeah.
And Rand was upset because they made these kind of economistic arguments that they didn't say like, no, it's morally wrong to tell a person that they can't rent the property that they own at whatever price they want. Friedman's were economistic, and Reed, and here's the big division between Reed and Rand. And you know, I said I'd get more into why Reed called it the foundation for economic education. There was a strand, and I think Leonard Reed and Milton Friedman represent this a lot, who thought that there wasn't really a war of values. They actually thought most people want a wealthy, free society. That's what they want. They just maybe don't understand how to get it or what's necessary for it to function. But if they understood free market economics, it would all work. And Rand and Murray Rothbard, who we haven't mentioned, kind of had a different attitude, which I actually think thickened the mix in a way that's interesting and true. It's like, it's just not true that if you could explain to everybody that, that policy is, creating, distributing benefits, but like, distributing concentrated benefits, but diffuse costs. And that's the incentive structure of that is bad. And it's like, no one can. I mean, most people, when you break it down to them, they're like, okay, let's impose the diffuse costs and get the concentrated benefits. Because they know some people like, it's great. It's like you're seeing this today with Doge. It's like everyone, every government job is a job, right? Someone has that job. Their family depends on it. It seems really cruel to end it. So Rand especially sort of thought that, no, there's a lot of the evil, she would call it. Like, no, these people are riven with envy and they do not want to see others succeed. And I think that is an element of humanity that can be seen. And Rothbard sort of emphasized the class war aspect of it, not in the Marxist sense, but that there's the class of people who benefit from government, the bureaucrats, the people who work for the government, the people who get more in benefits than they give in taxes.
These are, Rand would call them looters and moochers.
Exactly, right? Looters and moochers. And you can't just explain to them that that's economically inefficient or it reduces human liberty. Like, they don't care. They're benefiting from it. So,
then how does Rand or Rothbard suggests that you convince those people because you're telling them you're completely useless.
Well, with Rand, you start with existence exists.
Yeah.
And,
Okay,
A is A and things are what they are.
And that's when then I reach for the acid and by the end of it.
Rand had, more than any of the others, really did think like the politics to her was like the third step. Like she built up this whole philosophy she called objectivism that you can study as you wish or deride as you wish, and the politics was a derivation of that. So Rand actually hated being called a libertarian because she's like, I'm an objectivist and a certain set of political ideas that absolutely are libertarian. Even though she
did not work hard. I mean, Rand, you mentioned this in the book, more than anybody is the great kind of popularizer of libertarian ideas, or kind of, and even people who grow to disagree with her remain influenced by her, and I think in profound ways. But was she was not really trying to convince people who were necessarily on the receiving end of freebies. It was more she was inspiring people so they wouldn't become that.
Right, yeah. She thought, and she was very bitterly disappointed when this didn't happen, that like, because Atlas Shrugged, if you haven't read it, is, the premise basically is like a super genius convinces all the other real super geniuses of finance and science and the arts that like, you don't want to contribute your gifts to this corrupt, controlling culture, and she leads them all the way to a little paradise. So she sort of dreamed that the real world versions of that would be her audience, and they would flock to her, and that wasn't really what happened. It was like college students and alienated loners, and the weird thing about Rand, especially if you've read Atlas Shrugged, to me as a libertarian, when I read it, it's like if you read this and you're not a libertarian, it feels like you're having your face shoved in a pile of dog crap that you left. It's like it's really unpleasant. But amazingly, like she was good enough as a popular novelist that like millions of people just like love those gripping
and it's
tales
spectacular.
and don't even get the ideas.
We've talked about this in other contexts, but people like Oliver Stone, who calls himself a socialist, loves Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead and Ayn Rand. So it's like there's an appeal there that is definitely beyond kind of economic thinking.
Yeah,
I mean, do you think that kind of and there was a split or different kind of directions went with different people, but do you think that the libertarian movement would have been better served if we had somehow generated or paid more attention to philosophers or cultural creators or people who were not talking about economics so much?
Yeah, you get the movement. The movement is a result of the free choices of free people. As Leonard Reed had a funny little gag whenever anyone would tell him like, I'm ceasing giving funding to fee, he would answer with like, well, our whole purpose is to expand the range of choices people have over their own resources and property. So I can only applaud that you are, choosing what you wish to do with your money. And thank you. And that shit actually worked. Like he raised millions of dollars, being like this sort of humble Zen monk. But but
he was a Zen monk who had been like the head of the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, then he bought a mansion in upstate here. When did he die, and under what circumstances?
He died in the early to mid '80s, and I don't think it was anything scandalous. He left Fee in kind of a crummy condition when he left, but it's still around. It had some money problems for a while. Right. But to address your question,
it's based in Atlanta.
Yeah, you get the movement that the free roiling of humanity creates. Like, I think it would have been great if there were more cultural creators, and there were more. Like the science fiction world had a lot of them. Robert Heinlein, but I would have, at least so when libertarians get around and try to say, what are the 10 best libertarian movies? At least we'd have more interesting choices, or the 10 most libertarian pop songs, or whatever of that. Like, that'd be nice.
Yeah, that's but I
that's always a bet.
Actually, if we had enough creators, we wouldn't have those conversations.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, which would be the real payoff.
That's just
talk a bit. You've mentioned Milton Friedman and Murray Rothbard, who are economists. Ludwig von Mises floats around early on in the book and is interesting. But in this interest of talking about the institutions that helped kind of codify and create or institutionalize things, the Mont Pelerin Society. How many of you have heard of the Mont Pelerin Society? Okay, a fair amount, right? But could you explain what that is and what function that's?
Yeah, that was a sort of another example of how embattled and marginalized this was, that like a group of like just a few dozen international economists, philosophers, legal thinkers. It was just could all get together in one like cushy place in Switzerland and form a group to push these ideas that back then they considered,
And
again,
that was what, 48?
47 is when that was
47,
founded. Yeah, a lot of this flourishing happened right after World War II because they really all were concerned. Hayek wrote that great book, The Road to Serfdom, that was kind of trying to tell the West, it's like, look, you've been at war with fascism and in alliance with communism, and you need to understand that the choices you're making are like leading you down a road that's similar to the things that you're supposed to be opposing. And it was very influential. So, and what did you say about Pellerin? So yeah, like it was a small group of people. They continue to meet today. Again, it's kind of a high level academic thing. And I think the reason why so many economists were central to this, and of the 5 people I consider central characters in this book, 4 of them were economists, is that the whole concept, the Adam Smithian concept of the invisible hand and the Hayekian concept of spontaneous order help answer the question that everyone has when you talk about limiting government, that like how does a functioning society work to everyone's benefit without someone in control? And like that's, I can't give the lecture here, but if you study the works of your Rothbard, Mises, and you think that they make sense, they explain to you how the free play of prices and private property, and if contracts are honored, like we actually create a world that is the closest to representing how rich we can be and how much the world is going to represent everyone's choices, not just the choices of the commissar or the board or the,
And I mean, this is coming out of, the 19th century, which was a liberal century compared to what came before it, but I mean, that it's kind of lost, I think, I remember when I started reading Reason in, I guess, the late 70s, early 80s, and people would harken back to a period where people really thought, like, if the government didn't oversee everything, like, how would products get to the supermarket shelf? Right. How would you know how much they cost, et cetera? And it seemed to me like, I mean, we grew up in an era where that battle had been won, in a big way by these people, not completely, but the idea that what, markets actually don't need somebody to control them the way they had been controlled. In fact, they work better when they're looser. Do you feel like we're backsliding on that?
In some respects, I mean, I think the current administration, while it has what are to many people kind of attractive sort of attitude of vandalization towards certain aspects of the state. Like certainly it's not driven by like a deep belief in human liberty. I mean, one of the main policies of the current administration is like literally moving human beings' bodies around to places they do not want to be just because of some law or regulation. So I don't think the fight is won. I mean, there's interesting things happen. Like, yesterday, Bezos announces that, this major American metro paper with a big national audience is going to have an editorial voice that, at least as he expresses it, is going to become, didn't use the word libertarian, but he talked about free markets and personal freedom. He meant libertarian. Like, it's kind of interesting. Like, that was not something as a libertarian I would have expected. And it a little bit is like, obviously.
And as a libertarian, you have to insist that he doesn't really mean it and that he's a liar, right?
Yeah, well, I don't know. We'll see.
Because if we have a long history in losing. We're the worst winners.
In a way,
We make the Trump administration seem beneficent. Yeah.
But that's an interesting thing. But you can look at it and say, like, well, surely you can just say, oh, it's the whim of one rich guy. And, like, in a way, it is the whim of one rich guy. But, like, that rich guy has owned the paper for a while. I think it's more fair to go, well, that rich guy felt unconstrained enough to act on this whim because he thinks there has been a cultural change. I mean, assume he doesn't want to drive his paper out of business with this choice. You never know. But also it's a great example of what libertarians love about free markets is it does allow the effusion of all sorts of peculiar things. Like if you posit that no one wants that Jeff Bezos, no one wants a major paper's editorial page to be libertarian. It's like, well, in the free market, we can have that. We can see if people do like it. And I'll stop talking now.
Let's, here's a cheap segue. Amazon started in Seattle. Let's shift to the West Coast a little bit because the book it's really about the libertarian movement after World War II for the most part. coming out of that. And there's East Coast stuff and there's West Coast stuff. It's like the original gangster rap.
Yeah, the major West
right?
Coast figure, I'd say, was a curious fellow named Robert LeFevre, who was not talked about much today, who I find very amusing. He was one of there was a lot of anarchism then and now in the libertarian movement, but a lot of them didn't like the word anarchism because it was associated with the destruction of, family and property.
It was Italians with
right.
cartoon bombs.
Exactly.
Stuff, right? Yeah.
So LeFevre did not believe government should exist, so he was an anarchist, but he didn't use the term. And he had he hated violence so much. And I want to talk a little bit about violence, actually, because I think I meant to sort of start off with this, because I think it's an interesting way to frame the libertarian mission. Like, you can just, we want limited government. We want to shrink government. And what does that mean? And, especially in the Doge age, a lot of people are concentrating it, like I said, like, it means that thing that used to happen isn't happening anymore. And we wanted that to happen. And that person's lost their job. It's like, great. But what government is, and libertarianism helps focus your mind on this, it's organized violence, right? And so the way I like to frame libertarianism, which sounds hippy-dippy and goofy, but it's absolutely true. It's like the project is about figuring out how to structure a social order with the least amount of violence and threats of violence, the least amount of, like, we're forcing you to do things, and if you don't do it, we're going to mess you up. Like, that's what it's about. It's a very hippy-dippy glorious thing. And LeFevre disbelieved in violence so much that he didn't even really believe that much in defensive violence. And he actually thought, this is one of his thought experiments, that if a thief, ties you up, but it's his rope, you shouldn't free yourself from that rope because you'd be violating your property rights.
Because if you cut the rope, you would be destroying
Which leads
his
to
property.
an interesting thing about libertarianism that
it's surprising more people haven't heard of him.
Yeah, exactly.
When you put it that way.
What's right? He was actually, he was one of the great teachers of the Koch brothers, the petrochemical billionaires who funded a lot of libertarian causes, including the magazine we work for. But that brings up another thing about libertarianism that obviously is. It's a strong point to certain curious thinkers, but I think it's a weak point to most people is like the rigorous application of the basic idea that, you shouldn't force, there should be no non-retaliatory violence. Like, it leads to certain things, like on the simpler level, like, and that means there should not be such a thing as a Food and Drug Administration, or there should not be such a thing as publicly funded education, to even weirder areas. And I, saying this, I believe all this stuff myself. Rothbard's explanation that, blackmail is not a crime. Like, you can't punish anyone for blackmail because, what is blackmail? Like, it's okay. It's like you're talking, you choose to say something. You can say whatever you want. You can say true things, you can say false things, and you come to someone and you give them an offer. Like, you offer to deal with them. Like, if you do something for me,
it's really kind of generous.
I won't say this thing about you. And it's like, that seems despicable, and no one likes that, and everyone thinks it should be illegal. And Rothbard, again, in this mission of figuring out how do we minimize violence, one of the conclusions he came to, which you can accept or not, is that if it's not a direct physical assault on your person or property, like, then it's okay. It's groovy. And you're like, blackmail, you're destroying my reputation. And Rothbard's like, what's a reputation? A reputation is just thoughts in other people's heads.
But if you're lying about somebody,
that's okay
same
thing.
for
You
him.
can lie. You can tell the truth. You can lie.
So you could say, this is I'm selling this as Diet Coke, but it's actually strontium 95 or something.
If it came to blackmail is a different thing. That's
okay,
just
so
like
fraud.
Blackmail, lying about someone is not.
Okay.
He had a contract. It gets a little complicated. Like, there had to be a contract or exchange.
Yeah.
If you are exchanging your property for what you believe is that, like, it should be that, because you're cheated if you're not getting that. But just telling a lie about someone is just telling a lie about someone. But anyway, my point is that, like, it leads to certain areas that strike many people as, like, very strange or almost demented. But to libertarians, it's like, we're just trying to figure this out. Like, we believe these things, and what does it mean? What does it imply?
What happened to the Freedom School that Robert LeFevre created?
There was a flood.
And this was in the late 50s, early 60s.
Starting, maybe the early 60s. I don't remember the exact date.
And one of his students, besides the Koch brothers, and he really kind of helped give them a kind of anarcho-capitalist libertarian understanding of the world, which had deep influences on them. Another one of their star students was Kerry Thornley, right? Could you explain who Kerry Thornley is?
Yeah, Kerry Thornley. This actually ties into how I became a libertarian. I'm like, you could call a Robert Anton Wilson libertarian, if you know who he is. He co-wrote a novel called Illuminatus that I read at a young age, and that, like, before I knew about Rand or Rothbard, that book turned me into a libertarian. And this kind of fun. Thornley was a principal in one of the earliest libertarian zines called The Innovator. He was one of the innovators of the idea of, which is still being pursued today, of like libertarian communities in the ocean. He was thinking of a submarine. Now we're talking about land. So he was a very early libertarian thinker, and coincidentally, he had been a Marine along with a guy named Lee Harvey Oswald. And Thornley wrote a novel before November 22nd, 1963. Before that day.
You're talking about what the generally agreed upon lie that when Kennedy was assassinated?
Yes, when Kennedy was sent
I'm not
to the
even
moon.
sure he was in Dallas, but yes, November 22nd.
The day John Kennedy set foot on the moon. So yeah, Thornley knew he had written a novel called The Idle Warriors, whose star was like a Romana Clef of Lee Harvey Oswald, because he had found Oswald a fascinating character. And there was a New Orleans if you saw we mentioned Oliver Stone, if you saw his really wonderful movie JFK, you might remember Jim Garrison, who was a New Orleans DA, who for some reason, despite the fact that the crime did not happen in his district, began investigating, and he kind of came to the belief, and Thornley, who kind of went insane in my estimation, began believing this, that he was like a second Oswald, or he was a Manchurian candidate from birth who somehow had a role in the Kennedy assassination.
Because they had served in the Marines together during the Cold War.
Yeah, like Thornley actually came to believe that I did have something to do with the Kennedy assassination. And he decided that Robert Anton Wilson was his CIA handler. It was all very interesting. So,
another great alum of the Freedom School.
I don't know what conclusion we're coming to here.
Went out of business after there was a big mudslide.
Yeah, there was a mudslide.
And they didn't have insurance because that was violence. And property insurance?
No, it's probably just a business decision. I honestly don't remember the answer to that question. And he also was an influence on a guy who started as like a hippie libertarian folk singer out of the LeFevre movement, and later became the congressman from Orange County, Dana Rohrabacher. Right. So Dana Rohrabacher started as a complete hippy-dippy anarchistic libertarian troubadour. And when I interviewed him about all that, you have to ask him, like, do you still believe that stuff? And this is when he was still in office. He's like, oh, a real politician would never tell you. But I think he didn't anymore. I think he didn't believe
and Dana
that stuff
Rohrabacher he was the model for Bob Roberts, right? The Tim Robbins.
I'm not, he should have been.
That was,
I'm not sure that he
Robbins
was,
said that. And,
oh, really?
Yeah. So that's an interesting little school. Go a little bit further west to Orange County and talk about R.C. Hoyles. He's another figure that is, comes up in the book and is a fascinating kind of early libertarian person who created a kind of set of newspapers that also kind of channeled these ideas into the book.
Yeah, R.C. Hoyles, he was just, again, one of these random dissociated weirdos who somehow fell into believing this stuff and corresponded with each other. He was very obsessed with how terrible public schools were, and he got very mad. We were saying all the libertarians get mad at each other. He'd get mad at Leonard Read or Mises if they didn't make abolishing public education as their main priority. That's if you are
the great line about the difference between public schools and whorehouses.
Right,
is that people want to be in whorehouses.
Right, exactly. It's like a whorehouse, and he was like a Midwestern businessman. Yeah, but he said whorehouse.
And then he created what became the Orange County Register and Freedom
and a chain of papers that he didn't name after himself or his family. He named the Freedom newspapers. That, like Jeff Bezos says now, promulgated a very libertarian.
Well, and during World War II, he was the only major newspaper publisher on the West Coast who spoke out against the
internment of the Japanese
Americans. Could you talk a little bit about that and why? That must have been a very difficult position to hold because. The war was going on. And,
if you were a libertarian, then you were very used to having nothing but positions that were socially difficult to hold. So, I think it was probably easy for him to just go, no, you can't round up human beings just because of their ancestry. Like, that's insane. That's criminal. You can't do that. And his libertarian beliefs and his, he was a cussed old goat kind of character, And it's like, so of course I'm going to say that. It's crazy. It's criminal. You can't do that.
Barry Goldwater is on the cover of the book, and he's mentioned in the book. Explain, how does he intersect with the modern libertarian?
Yeah, he was, in the 40s and 50s, these thinkers didn't have the slightest notion of intersecting their ideas with actual politics as it was practiced. Nick mentioned the concept of the remnant that floated around the movement. It's just like, we just need to keep these ideas alive. We have no idea when or if they will ever be actuated. We don't really have a great their social theory of how to make all this work was like, write a really great, smart book that explains it. It's like there were plenty of those books, but it didn't change the world. God, what was the question?
Goldwater.
Goldwater, right. So
Yeah.
Goldwater comes along in the early 60s, and he sounds very libertarian in many respects, at least, about kind of anti-New Deal stuff. He was terrible on foreign policy, and Rothbard hated him for that and thought any libertarian who supported him was crazy. But as an actual fact of intellectual history, like nearly everyone who was like a teenager in the early 60s Goldwater era who went on to have a career in libertarianism, like was a Goldwater fan at the beginning. He was a spark that made me think, wow, these ideas, or at least part of them, can have some hold on culture. And in fact, there was arguments between Reed and one of his colleagues, Benjamin Rogie, and I think it's in the book. I forget which one took which side, but one of them actually worried a little bit because like their mission was educating the world mind by mind. And one of those two was like the country is not actually ready for this. Like we have not succeeded in convincing enough of the American population that these ideas are true for it to really work to have a politician push it. And in fact, as everyone has laughed at Goldwater ever since, obviously he was indeed trounced. The country was not in any way ready for his ideas.
Yeah, but he ran for president in '64 and got smoked by up to that point the largest electoral blowout.
The largest defeat any major party candidate had.
What was Goldwater talking about? Because that electrified people. Was it mostly his anti-New Deal type thing, or
all these bureaucrats are managing us and taxing us.
And I guess he seemed like a different. He was kind of a cowboy character, and politics was kind of an East Coast game, right? And
exactly. He represented the spirit of the West. There's a great book called The Yankee Cowboy War that I recommend that sort of does a conspiracy theory take on the shift of American power between Eastern interests and Western interests, and the Western interests become like oil, petrochemicals, and then later, aerospace and computers, and like we definitely live in a West Coast world now.
That book, which was written by Carl Oglesby, who was the former head of Students for Democratic Society, is interesting because then when you look at things from cowboy Yankees, suddenly LBJ obviously killed Kennedy because Kennedy is part of the Eastern. Right. He's a Yankee. And LBJ is a
and Oglesby is actually a great example of a libertarian convert. He was obviously a total commie because he was a big SDS guy, and by the turn of the 70s, he was pretty libertarian leaning. There was a lot of success with a character named Carl Hess was especially mixed. Like he was a totally groovy radical 60s dude, but then he was an anarcho-capitalist, and he debuted his ideas in an article in Playboy, which was a big deal in 1969. Like Playboy ran like this giant essay on anarcho-capitalism because of Carl Hess. He was a field marshal of the revolution, is sort of a Castro-esque figure
who had been Barry Goldwater's chief speechwriter.
Exactly. He was a Goldwater boy, and they remained friends even after Hess became a total raging hippie and anarcho-capitalist.
Where did Goldwater's foreign policy come from, and how did that fit? Like you were saying,
you just hate communism. Like obviously, if you're a libertarian, you hate communism, of course. And so some people might go, well, we've got to fight this Cold War, even a hot war against the Soviets. And that was one of the big dividing lines between the kind of Buckley Goldwater conservative movement and the libertarian movement. Is the true libertarians of the Reed Rothbard style understood that fighting a war against communism involves the mass murder of innocents inherently they're talking about nuclear war, and B involves a domestic apparatus of taxation and oppression that we don't want. And the conservatives are no, we've got to fight communism. And Reed has a great quote, I think it might be in this book, about he's his job is not to fight communists but to fight the ideas that are behind communism, and many of those ideas are in the heads of very respectable Americans who do not think of themselves as communists. So they were cognizant that war meant mass murder, and that's one of the through lines. Especially
So they would have been better dead or better read than dead.
Sure. Well,
Yeah.
Rothbard's joke is like the Buckley's thing was
Yeah.
like better you dead than me read.
Right.
It was making decisions that were going to annihilate the lives of millions of people just because of what you felt, and that was you can't do that. You can't fight a libertarianly just war in the modern world.
Let me, and then I want to jump to a couple of more modern moments, but just to go back to Leonard Read for a second. You described this moment where he was hauled up in front of a congressional committee.
Yeah, the Buchanan Commission.
Yeah, which
it was kind of,
I had never heard of before.
Yeah, it was a little, it was a McCarthy era thing, but it was kind of like a McCarthyism of the left, I guess you could put it. A thing called the Buchanan Commission, where the funders of FEE and various other free market organizations were like called in, essentially to name names. They were everyone was asked, you need to report everything you've given to support these causes, and there was a good character named W.C. Mullendore, who was an executive with SoCal Edison and a big early funder of FEE, and he wrote some great rage-filled letters, some of which I think are quoted in the book about, it's like, look, you, the government, manage my company to such a degree and on so many levels that like it's absolutely a part of my mission as a corporate board guy or whatever to attempt to influence political ideas. And if I can't do that freely without you guys inquiring and publicizing and nosing into the choices I make, like that's not what that's un-American and it's unacceptable. But yeah, there was kind of a explain to us who was supporting these ideas that were considered very sinister. To get back to that, like these ideas were not respectable. They were.
So by the end of the 60s, they became pretty respectable, though, right? Or they were more respectable than they had ever been.
Yeah, you had, and again, it was so limited that you can like pick out the moments, like that big Playboy article by Hess I mentioned, and then like Murray Rothbard started getting on the New York Times op-ed page around 70, 71, and then
and you mentioned the New York Times Magazine story by the future Wired editor or founder Louis Rossetto.
Yeah, the New York Times Sunday Magazine in 70, I think, had a big cover story called "The New Right Credo, Libertarianism," and one of the authors of it, as Nick just said, was Louis Rossetto, who later founded Wired Magazine, a big Silicon Valley thought leader. So these little things were happening, and like major publishers published anarchist texts by Murray Rothbard for a New Liberty in the early 70s, by David Friedman, Milton's son, who was an anarchist, called The Machinery of Freedom.
And then Robert
Nozick, like this philosopher arises from Harvard, wins a National Book Award for a book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. That was ultimately decided that you could have a morally justified state. But the whole magic of the book, what made it weird is he actually was like, you do have to answer this question. Like if you're a political philosopher who believes in the state, you need to be able to justify it. And it's hard to do. And he did it in an extremely complicated, modern philosophical way. And I think he failed. I don't think he did justify the state. And there's great essays floating around by Rothbard and Roy Childs explaining why he was wrong. But this became a big thing. So suddenly like, there's a brilliant egghead with the Harvard pedigree who actually believes in a limited state and takes anarchism seriously enough to realize I have to refute it rigorously. That was
and the state that he was calling for was so radically smaller than what the kind of baseline
absolutely
was.
Minimal. Just like protect people's life and property from force and fraud, and run the courts in defense. And then in the mid 70s, like Hayek wins a Nobel in economics, Friedman wins a Nobel in economics. The 70s were certainly the beginning of the cementing of something like respectability.
And how much of that was that people were looking for alternatives? Because by that point, there had been kind of recognizably conservative ideas, which were mostly reactionary. And early on in the book, you talk about how libertarianism is rooted in the founding of the republic, but it's not reactionary. So that's different because conservatives, Buckley, when he started the National Review, he famously said, it stands athwart history yelling stop.
Right.
That was not what libertarians were talking about.
No.
So how much of the kind of move towards libertarian ideas was just that conservatives had failed and liberals, like nobody wanted to live in that world, right? This is a world of, high unemployment and high inflation and wars and horrible crimes committed by governments coming to light.
Yeah, I hate saying sentences like this because, like, if you read a lot of 20th century American history, you come across a sentence like this a million times and you just start to sigh. But yeah, it was an era of the failure of the Vietnam War and Watergate and all this cliche stuff. But it's true. Like there was just plenty of things that showed aware people that, this system is rotten and doesn't work. And like the 60s counterculture was a reaction to that. And communes and the Back to the Land movement was a reaction to that. And then libertarianism kind of reaction to that. Reagan in his own way is a reaction to that. So yeah, it was.
Yeah. So Reagan, you throw in the quote, Reason magazine, which was founded in '68, interviewed Reagan in 1975, right? Right after he had been a 2-term governor of California and then had left office. And he called libertarianism is the heart and soul of the conservative movement.
Conservative, something like that.
Yeah, and then it is interesting that the rest of the interview and then the editors of Reason were like, okay, well, how about legalizing gambling? No, you can't do that. Yeah. How about prostitution? No. Yeah. How about like loosening up cigarettes? No, like everything. Yeah. But it's the heart and soul. But,
right. Yeah.
But talk about Reason magazine, which was founded in '68, and this is one of the institutions that helped kind of distribute the ideas as well as sharpen the arguments. What's the role of Reason in the modern libertarian movement?
Sure. Yeah.
Besides being the best goddamn place to work.
Right. Right. I deliberately don't really talk about that because I have worked for the magazine mostly since 1994. But it's, to crow a little, like it's the place where libertarians have met to, sharpen their ideas and apply them to the current scene as it goes by. It never, like, Foundation for Economic Education just kind of had the same sort of homiletics about, trade and, business regulation and such. We try to apply libertarian thought to the scene as it passes by. We try to be ecumenical within the libertarian world. It's a place for libertarians to fight things out. And in the internet age, it's all online. You can basically see the record of how, libertarians have sharpened their arguments about modernity. And, it's, I still think it's an important thing to do. This is a little bit grumpy old man, dissociative complaining, I guess. Like I don't love the degree to which the modern communication world kind of seems to be divided between one sentence, a 6-second video clip, or like a 4-hour podcast. Like right. I'm like nowhere. But like I can't like people, a good little 3,000 word magazine article. Right?
The people have spoken. Great. Right. You can't complain. Right. I mean, whatever is perfect.
Yeah.
Right?
So and I do think that being able to write things that are like 800 to 4,000 words to hash things out, and in the internet age, link to support and back up the things you're saying. Like. That's great. And, I think the internet world just kind of reacts to headlines or their attitude about what, they decided they like or whatever.
The other two institutions I just want to touch on real quickly is the Libertarian Party. That got founded in 71?
Yeah. First convention in 72, the meeting to found it was in this guy named David Nolan's living room in 71, the first national convention.
And David Nolan lives on. He died a few years ago, but in the Nolan chart, which, you probably have taken the world's smallest political quiz. It's basically that. And can we say with any certainty that it's rigged, that everybody ends up being kind of libertarian?
Well, yeah. Because that's the thing about libertarianism is the more abstract you make the principles of wider agreements. Like, well, people should be able to do what they want as long as they don't hurt other people, right? It's like, yeah. So we should not have a Food and Drug Administration. Like, really? Huh? How'd you get there? But like, you can get there. Like, there is a logic to that, but it's not can't be convinced across the table at the county fair, probably, or maybe you can.
So the Libertarian Party, and it first ran a candidate in 1972.
Yeah, and it got an electoral vote, the first electoral vote libertarians ever got, because
or another way of saying it, the only.
Of course, didn't I say? Yeah, of course. And also, like, his running mate was a woman, and so she was the first woman to get an electoral
And she was Jewish.
Vote. Yes, a Jewish woman. Yeah. I'm not entirely sure she was the first Jewish person to get an electoral vote, but it's possible she was. At any rate,
there were rumors about James Buchanan that were haunting him. So.
The Electoral College, if you're an elector, you can actually do whatever you want. And there was a guy named Roger McBride who was the he was Rose Wilder Lane's heir, despite not being any relation to Rose Wilder Lane. Rose did not have any children, but Roger was one of these eager young libertarians who I mentioned she used to be excited to find, and she sort of took him in, and he became her heir. And so he was that kind of guy. He was Rose Wilder Lane's heir, and he was a Republican elector from Virginia, and he hated Nixon for like the same reasons the Libertarian Party was founded: wage and price controls, ending the gold standard. We can't tolerate you. So he's like, I'm voting for the Libertarian, and again, they've never gotten an electoral vote since. And they were only on the ballot in 2 states. And the candidate was a professional philosopher named John Hospers. He was taught at, I think, USC at that time. And was gay, actually, though he wasn't like super public about it. So.
Although, looking back, it's kind of obvious.
Yeah.
No, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, he was unapologetic. He just wasn't necessarily public. And then the other institution, which published this book. So, we'll take whatever you say with a grain of salt about that, but is the Cato Institute, which was founded in San Francisco.
77, yeah. Yeah, that was the first, as I alluded to, like libertarians through the 40s, 50s, and 60s did not, until Goldwater, did not imagine they could actually interact with the wheels of policy. But by the 70s, for all the little happy things we're just talking about, like this guy named Ed Crane, who was a stockbroker dude in California and really believed in this stuff, managed to talk the very wealthy petrochemical billionaires, the Koch brothers, into financing an institute that actually would attempt to do libertarian policy work, not just, homiletics about free trade and the fee variety. And Cato was founded to do that and has been doing it ever since, and has, grown. It's always difficult to assess influence per se, and I think in the Trump era, they're probably less influential than they otherwise would be because of the Trumpian attitudes about immigration and trade. But they've continued to grow, and if you want to go find the policy study that defends any libertarian idea, they probably produced it, and they have a nice building, and they publish nice little books like this. And I worked for them for a few years, and
So I guess before we go to audience Q&A, let me ask, what, taking the longer view, what are the big libertarian wins? Because it's, libertarians, we sometimes talk about it as, it's like Schrodinger's cat.
Yeah.
We're either running everything or we're completely irrelevant. It's two mutually exclusive ideas.
I would say,
but what are the big wins, do you think, for the libertarian
The
movement?
things that have happened in the last 30 years that are clearly libertarian derived and I think are good and are spreading include school vouchers, gradual legalization of marijuana and removing it to psychedelic thing. That's all very libertarian. Milton Friedman's ideas about monetary policy, while they did not dominate Fed thinking, had a great deal to do with how the Fed has managed for about 30 years there to not become the inflationary monster that libertarians fear it, inherently is and eventually will be. Friedman was very important in getting rid of the military draft. He was one of the leading ideologues behind that. International floating exchange rates. General, like the deregulation of the Carter era. You still find some people who still complain about it, but I think trucking and air travel are a lot more accessible to people than they used to be. And these are all libertarian ideas. They weren't necessarily actuated. And, they probably never will be. It's not like, oh, we need a politician who's 100% libertarian. It's great to have that. You have scattered ones, but you're not going to get victories that way. You need to get people who don't believe the entire body of ideas to at least agree on certain things, and that's probably the only way progress
What about
gets
in the cultural arena? And by that, I'm thinking of to go back to the West Coast kind of end of things. And you wrote a book about Burning Man. It was one of the first book-length analyses of that movement. But Burning Man seems to be very libertarian not in its explicit messaging, but in its presence.
Right. There's a great phrase that I think at a certain point I wanted the book to be called this. It's a Leonard Read little thing. And he just said, well, what are you for? What are you libertarians for? And he says, anything that's peaceful. So that attitude against conservatives, Nick was saying that Reagan thing, conservatives just had a certain set of cultural attitudes that they held to that restricted peaceful things, and things like gay marriage, transgender acceptance, things like Burning Man, just like the idea that if you want to live a certain way, have a certain lifestyle, if you are not if it's peaceful, if you're not damaging other people's personal property, that is to be celebrated. That is to be supported. And in that sense, American culture, from the 60s on, has been immensely more libertarian than it used to be. And it upsets lots of people. And, there's certainly changes in mores. And I think, it was a Thomas Szasz thing. Thomas Szasz was a controversial psychiatrist in the libertarian movement who we can't really get into him, but look him up. And, he liked to stress that, like, human life, a good, healthy, happy human life is hard. It's not given to you. It's hard. And so when we're certainly, I think, in a movement where, like, there's a pendulum shift in mores. Like, there is a certain set of mores in the 50s and 60s that made many people feel restricted and they wanted to escape them. And a lot of them did. And then a generation of that happens. And a lot of people are like, that change in mores didn't actually work out very well for a lot of people either. And we're going to go back. And to me, it's, this is wishy-washy, but I think, like, there's not an answer that ought to be imposed, and human life is difficult, and following whatever set of mores may or may not satisfy you, but like that you have the cultural liberty in the sense that, like, you're going to get away with it, and you're not only not going to get arrested, but you're not going to be, like, driven from society for living this way or having this belief. I think that makes for a better world. I mean, a lot of people, I think it doesn't, because they just see a lot of stuff they don't like, but that's freedom, baby.
I have inadvertently, I'm always saying, okay, this is the final question, and then I have one more. This is the final question I have for you before we do some audience Q&A. One of the great libertarian dreams has always been, there's the right, there's conservatives and liberals or progressives, and reactionaries or whatever, and, like, at some point they're going to realize, like, they're losing, and they're going to team up with the libertarians and do a proper fusion where they're the junior partner in a coalition with libertarians. And we went through a phase where libertarians were clearly in the National Review model, where the little brother who was really there just to take the first bullet, in that coalition, and then you could get rid of them. And then Murray Rothbard certainly tried to make inroads with the left. We're at a moment now where both major parties and more broadly the groups they represent, conservatives and liberals, seem to be fading in their traditional sense. Do you see any great future for the libertarians? Either getting a lot of refugees from these other places or forming a working coalition with them?
I see why you might, and the answer is really temperamental, and it probably has to do with my age and how tired I am or whatever. But I'm not feeling, despite the fact that there's a lot of energy that feels super libertarian in a kind of like tear down the state way, especially from the Musk end of what's going on now. This is like what you're saying, libertarians are bad winners. This might just be a libertarian being a poor winner or a bad winner or whatever. Like, I don't feel that the general cultural and governmental energy is accepting of the full range of libertarian freedom. But on a strictly like political coalition level, you can tell a story, and we'll find out if it's true pretty quickly, that maybe, Trumpism is going to make a lot of people with a more full bore libertarian vision realize, I can't hang with the Republican Party because I don't like the tariff stuff or the immigration stuff or the amassing of dictatorial executive power stuff or the imperialistic, advances stuff. And that maybe that does leave a room for, it should, right? It seems like it should.
And on the left,
sure
you have people who are like, you know what, I kind of miss free speech.
Yeah.
And markets really aren't that bad.
Yeah, maybe. I hope they come to believe that. So there's every reason to be hopeful, even if I, again, for eccentric personal reasons, maybe aren't as hopeful as I should be.
You are like a libertarian Sisyphus, but you keep getting, the rock keeps rolling back over you every day.
Feels good.
Like you get to the top, and that's when you're really on the bottom. Okay, we're going to thank you, Brian Doherty. The new book is Modern Libertarianism.